It's a great honor to have you here today with us, a world-renowned researcher, professor at the Catholic Institute of the Varieties, who writes extensively on political philosophy and international relations. And among your numerous works and public appearances, I'd like to draw special attention to the abstracts from your interview with eagleeyeexplore.com of the last year, and you made a good point by saying that, I'll quote it, the ideological war against Russia is in many ways a proxy for a deeper cultural and political war being waged within Europe itself, a war against pluralism, tradition, and dissent. And if we put this war in a larger perspective, given all recent developments in the Western world, in Europe, in the Middle East, what role, in your opinion, do ideas in general and religion in particular play in the world politics of today?
I think ideas and religion play an absolutely fundamental role in European politics. We're invited to discuss whether there is any room for diplomacy in contemporary international relations. And if that question is put, as it is, by a Russian academic, clearly the target of the question is Europe. It's not the United States of America, because diplomacy has recently restarted with the United States of America. And of course, Russia has, as we know, relations with all kinds of other countries. So why is this question put? I am an admirer of the French sociologist and historian Emmanuel Todd, who recently, a year or two ago, published his book La Défaite de l'Occident, the defeat of the West, the defeat of the West. And Todd attributes the defeat of the West, what he claims to analyze as the defeat of the West, to nihilism, to Western nihilism. Now, he puts the West in one category, but I'm going to talk about Europe. I'll leave Scott to talk about the Americans. I think we have seen a lot of nihilism from America. I think in the early stages of the Iran war, when Donald Trump said he might bomb Carg Island just for fun, I think that was an example of nihilism. I think when Pete Hegseth said that the great thing about Trump was that he allowed the American armed forces to act as viciously as possible from day one, viciously. Day one, of course, was the day when America bombed 160 schoolgirls in a double strike. So there's plenty of moral nihilism, the kind of nihilism that is so well described by Russian 19th century novelists. But in Europe, there's perhaps less this brutal moral nihilism. There is instead of what I would call a metaphysical or technical nihilism. And what I mean by that is that European politics is based, as I see it, on the belief in nothing. That's what nihilism is. And when I say the belief in nothing, I don't mean that they don't believe in anything. They believe that nothing is something. They believe that reality can be structured by thought, that reality can be structured by will. And this belief, which you may find this a rather obscure remark to make, we can see it, I think, in all kinds of different aspects of policy. We can see it, for example, in the belief that a man can become a woman. All right? That is an example of what I'm talking about, this policy of illusion, this completely illusory idea that by a mere act of will, that somebody can overcome something as fundamental as their biological reality. We see it, frankly, in the European Union project itself, which, of course, is a project aimed at overcoming and passing over the geographical, cultural, historical realities of Europe, which are of course profoundly diverse. We see this policy of illusion in the West's foreign policy, in its support, for example, for Bosnia in 1995. Bosnia is an illusion. There's no such thing as a Bosnian state. I'm not trying to be rude about the inhabitants of that territory, but there is absolutely no such thing as a Bosnian state, neither in history nor now. Same thing with Kosovo. The reality of Kosovo is that it's a greater Albania. That's the actual reality. The Kosovo Albanians are not Kosovars, they are Albanians. So this is another example of the policy of illusion. And this policy of illusion is absolutely systemic in Europe. The obsession with narrative control has become the principal activity of European governments. I learnt recently that there are more people working in the communications department of the European Parliament than there are members of the European Parliament. There are about 700 members of the European Parliament, but there are more than 700 people who work in communication, and that to me is very symbolic. And it's this technical nihilism, this policy of illusion, this policy of narrative control, which enables what many people, I'm sure, in this room and in this country certainly identify as double standards. Double standards are very annoying, they're very hypocritical, but they're actually the result of severe cognitive dissonance. They are a result of a mindset which says that reality doesn't matter. So, for example, we hear in Europe, as I'm sure you all know in this room, that Russia is losing the war in Ukraine and that Russia is about to invade Europe. Okay? Those two things cannot both be true. It's just impossible. It's either one or the other, all right? We hear that NATO is a defensive alliance. Well, it's not possible to believe that if you know anything about NATO in the last 20 years or so. We know that the only operations that NATO has conducted have been offensive. And I'm often reminded, listening to European politicians, of the White Queen in Alice Through the Looking Glass. The White Queen at one point says, "I can believe 6 different impossible things before breakfast," because she practices, and it seems to me that they practice as well. And again, this policy of illusion, this is what I call technical nihilism, also explains the rejection of reality. You know, we know that no European politician will ever admit who sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline. They can't. It's psychologically impossible. If you realize that your captors, your terrorists, are in your own house, it's impossible, and you've let them in, it's impossible for you to accept that. It's just psychologically unbearable. And this attitude also, I think, explains one of the biggest obstacles to diplomacy, with Russia particularly, which is, again, this is a terrible problem all over Europe. It's a particular problem in Britain. I live in France, but I'm from Britain. This moral framing. Every political issue in Europe is tackled in terms of moral framing. I learned recently that after the beginning of the 2022 military operation in Ukraine, the Norwegian foreign minister apparently said, "This is not a time for understanding, this is a time to condemn." What a statement, what a statement. And we're now in Europe in the same position as that which Karl Marx advocated in his introduction to Hegel's philosophy of right. There's a passage in that work where Marx denounces attempts to understand. He refers to intellectual analysis as criticism. And he says criticism is not an anatomical knife, it's not a surgeon's knife, instead it's a weapon. The enemy is not to be refuted, he's not to be disproved, he is to be destroyed. That's the intellectual posture of European politics today. And if you think about it, all the concepts of international relations that have come into being in recent years, the rules-based international order, the use of sanctions, the nudge theory, the theory of nudge, it's not actually an international relations concept, but this idea that people should be essentially forced or at least encouraged to make good choices, the concept of soft power, the fight against disinformation, all these new concepts are all about coercion. In other words, about imposing your will. And if I can again quote Alice in Wonderland, you may remember there's an exchange between Humpty Dumpty and Alice, where Humpty Dumpty says, Alice says, Humpty Dumpty says, when I use a word, it means what I want it to mean. And Alice says, well, you can't make words mean what you want to mean. And Humpty Dumpty says, yes, I can. The question is, who is to be master? And so I think that diplomacy is currently impossible with Europe, or rather, if politics is the continuation of war, if war is the continuation of politics by other means, then diplomacy from the European perspective today is simply coercion by other means.